Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the Dialogue Out Loud series. I'm Taylor Petrie, editor of Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought. Today, we're excited to have with us Bob Rees, well known to many in this community as a writer and thinker for more than 50 years. We're really excited to welcome him to discuss his most fascinating article, Truth and Reconciliation, Reflections on the 40th Anniversary of the LDS Church's Lifting of the Priesthood and Temple Restrictions for Black Mormons of African Descent. Rees examines in this article the current state of affairs with respect to racism in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and proposes a path forward that adopts the truth and reconciliation approach, including radical honesty and making amends. Bob, welcome. It's so nice to talk to you about your work.
Thank you, Taylor. It's always a privilege to do something to further dialogue.
So, tell us a little bit about your interest in the history and solutions to LDS racism. Why have you dedicated some time to writing on this?
Well, it is, in a sense, I grew up in a racist family, a racist community. I don't remember seeing a Black person when I was living in, let's say, in Arizona and Colorado. Those communities were almost entirely white. When my father came back from the Second World War in 1945 and taught the gospel to me, I was in a foster home at the time, and he taught the gospel to me, and that was the beginning. I lived essentially in a godless world for the first decade of my life, and then joined the church, and like everyone of my generation, accepted certain things as axiomatic, including the fact that what I learned from my culture, from my heritage, were that Blacks were inferior to whites, is something that seemed just part of the fabric of our culture. I had, when I moved to Long Beach from a small Arizona town, I moved to Long Beach, California when I was 15 and went to a school with a significant Black population. And it was the first time I'd really been able to see and mingle with and interact with Blacks of African descent. And I can remember walking down the streets of Long Beach, seeing a Black man and a white woman walking toward me. And I remember instinctively clutching my fists as if there was something morally wrong with what I was seeing. And that was what I had been taught. When I went to BYU in 1953, I don't think there was a single Black student on the campus. I went on my mission to Chicago and the great, or the Northern States Mission as it was called, and had the experience of knocking on the doors of Black families and teaching them an initial lesson, but was instructed not to go back. It wasn't until after my mission that I joined the Army and went to Fort Ord, California for my basic training, and then went to the Great South, to Georgia, to do my military police training. And on the plane, I actually joined the Army with my missionary companion, and we flew from Provo to Laramie, Wyoming, to pick up to change planes, and there we picked up a Black kid from Haiti who had joined the military. We made friends with him on the flight to Orlando, and then when we got off the plane and got on the bus, we sat down, and the bus driver politely came over and addressed him and said, "You'll need to move to the back of the bus." And I moved over and said, "Oh, there's lots of room here." And he said again to this Black soldier, "You have to move to the back of the bus." And I looked at the back of the bus and saw the color line, and I was shocked. I know on some subconscious level, I knew what was going on in the late 50s and 60s in the South, but it just was a shock to me. And then went to Fort Gordon, Georgia, where I did my military police training, and there saw a very integrated army, as many blacks were part of the army. My sergeant was black, and I just began to question why this social situation existed. I came back, finished my graduate work, finished my undergraduate work at BYU, went to the University of Wisconsin, and there began to receive a real liberal education, because Wisconsin was one of the most liberal campuses in the country. And then I just continued to, as that kind of began my examination of my religion and questioning of certain things. And I really wrestled with the idea of blacks in the priesthood, but had rationalized it by saying if the church had welcomed blacks into the church, given them the priesthood in the middle of the 19th century, given the political situation, it was possible that the church could have become a primarily dominant black church, because in Missouri and elsewhere, at least Joseph Smith's theology was welcoming to blacks, and he ordained blacks to the priesthood. So I heard this rationalization, kind of accepted it, but still was very uneasy about it. And when I was teaching at UCLA, I began to teach black literature. It was a time when white men could do that, or white teachers could, and teaching and reading Ralph Ellison and James Baldwin and Toni Morrison and other black writers, I suddenly understood for the first time in my life something about what it meant to be black in a dominant white culture. And I again began to read more deeply into the scriptures, and could remember the Book of Mormon scripture, all are alike to me, black and white, male and female, bond and free. And then as editor of Dialogue, I received this manuscript across my desk from one Lester Bush, and with the manuscript of Mormonism's Negro problem, I was the history of Mormonism and the Negro policy. There was a thick binder of all of his research. And as I read that article, it was as if scales fell from my eyes, and I saw for the first time the truth of what our teaching and our history was. And what was so impressive about Lister's article was that it was very dispassionate. It was a model of objective, sincere, responsible scholarship. And knowing that it was really kind of like having somebody put a bomb in my hands, I called my editorial staff together, and we talked about it. This could be a problem for us. We knew that Dialogue was not that it was controversial by this time among the leaders of the church and many members of the church. So we decided, after really a thorough discussion and prayer, that we would publish it. And but we decided, and in the spirit of Dialogue, to ask 3 scholars to respond to it. So we asked Jane England, Hugh Nibley, and Gordon Thomason, 3 really respected scholars, to respond to it, which they did with different perspectives. And we published it. Before publishing it, however, we had word had gotten out, and my mentor and the most influential teacher I had, Robert K. Thomas, was vice president of BYU, and he called me and said, you shouldn't publish this, Bob. And I said, well, I understand that it's controversial, but I think we've decided to do it. And he said, that would be a mistake. And I said, why? And he said, the brethren don't want you to do that. I said, how do you know? And he said, from sources high up. And I said, Bob, I said, we've thought about this, we've prayed about it. I assume if publishing it is a mistake, I'll be forgiven. And he said, you won't. And he said, you face some significant consequences of this, which I took to be possible excommunication. It was really a very difficult place, but I felt, and we felt, morally compelled to publish something that seemed true and seemed sensible and seemed responsible. So one of the things we did was to put together an ad that of a very prominent black man looking out at the camera. And underneath it, there was a quote from Joseph Fielding Smith, "Darkies are wonderful people and they have a place in our church." And I said, and the caption was, we now have a context in which to put this. And so this ad, I later published in Dialogue an article, the story of an ad that never ran, because we had, it was taken both to the University of Utah student newspaper and the BYU student newspaper, and in both instances it was turned down. So it was an ad that never appeared, but I think it really, from my point of view, looking back and having read recently a kind of a history of that time and of Lester's article, and I had the privilege, my wife and I had the privilege of being at the 40th anniversary celebration, and Lester and Greg Prince were there. And we met afterwards and talked about what had happened. But I think that was the beginning of the unraveling of this very destructive teaching and practice in the church.
So Bush's article is in 1973. By 1978, the church has actually ended this practice of prohibiting black members of the church from attending the temple and black men from holding the priesthood. What other efforts has the church made in the last several decades to resolve this problem? And why do you think that they have fallen short of their intended target?
Well, starting in 78, with the Dialogue issue was published in 76. Some people feel that it had an influence on President Kimball's decision to rescind the prohibition, to change the doctrine and the policy. And I think many people, I remember hearing, we had some friends, Susan and David Egley, who had moved from our congregation in West Los Angeles to Salt Lake City, and we'd had many discussions about this. They called us to say the church had done that, and we, as a family, had been praying about this, hoping that this day would come. And so when that news came, it was very joyful news to us. We rejoiced, as I think many people did. There was the common understanding that President Kimball had received a revelation to reverse a previous revelation, a revelation given either to Joseph Smith or to Brigham Young. And so that mythology persisted, that this had been a revelation, that the Lord had spoken and that it was God's doing. That did not satisfy me, because I knew what the doctrine had been from the originally, and then when Brigham Young had changed it. The further history, research, and the fact that more blacks began to join the church because of the lifting of the ban. There began to be black members who wanted their own congregation. They formed the Genesis branch in Salt Lake. But there began to be more and more study of history. And then the church, with responsible scholars like Bob Rees and others looking deeper into our history, the church published its official doctrine, or official paper on race and priesthood, and that, in a sense, what it did for the first time was to acknowledge that the teachings of the past were erroneous, that they were not based on revelation, they were based on mythology, and the church disavowed those teachings. Anything that's different from what we are now teaching was not inspired. But there was not ever an apology. There was not ever a what we would call truth and reconciliation. There was a wish for that, but one of the consequences is that racism continued and still continues today, both in American society, in Utah, and in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. At the same time that the church is growing the fastest in Africa and in nations in Brazil where there's African heritage. And so my own sense in reading this history and knowing of it is the one step that was missing was that the church had not fully apologized, had not taken steps for some kind of reconciliation. In fact, I thought that this would be happening at the 40th anniversary of the rescinding of this, and I was really grateful for the opportunity to go to the conference center and on that celebration. And I was very interested in what seemed to me a kind of contradictory message. One was this beautiful message from the black members of the church, the Bonner Choir, other people who sang and who told stories and who acted out some of the history, and the fact that there was in that celebration no apology, no acknowledgement. There was, in fact, a very clear direction. Some people want to look backward. We want to look forward. And so there was clearly an intention to, not go back and look at the history, not go back and look at what had happened, but to look forward. And while I could understand that, I felt something was missing. I was fortunate to live in a time when there was the Truth and Reconciliation campaign in South Africa, when Desmond Tutu and many other people were involved in that. I can remember when I was teaching at UCLA, that Desmond Tutu came to campus, and I met him, and he talked about the Truth and Reconciliation campaign, and I just remembered that there had to be something that made a really a kind of final and clear cleavage from that past. And so I was thinking about that over the years. I felt this was one thing that the church could do. And so that was why I wrote the article, and that led me to look at a number of different things, including evidence of continuing racism in the church and in Utah and among the Latter-day Saints. So we're not where we should be. And my work, I think people know that some friends and I started the Bountiful Children's Foundation a number of years ago. And We are in a number of African countries, and I've traveled to Madagascar, which is part of the African community, and our work there. And I'm, Margaret Blair and others who've gone to the DRC and are doing work so there's a lot of interaction between the church and what's happening in Africa, and the church is growing in Africa. My concern is that many of the people in Africa know nothing about this history. And if they discover this and wonder, why didn't I know this? Why hasn't something been done to kind of more permanently heal what the trauma of this history? So I think it would just be such a spiritually mature thing to do, to really do a formal truth and reconciliation campaign patterned after what happened in South Africa.
Bob, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure to have you on the show to talk to you more about this proposal. We hope that our listeners have enjoyed this conversation and have learned something new about healing the past and present racism in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. If you'd like to learn more, we encourage you to check out Robert Rees' Truth and Reconciliation, Reflections on the 40th Anniversary of the LDS Church's Lifting of the Priesthood and Temple Restrictions for Black Mormons of African Descent, and the summer 2023 issue of Dialogue, and to explore other resources on this topic there, including a link to Lester Bush's classic article. To our listeners, thank you for joining us today. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and colleagues, and don't forget to leave us a review or get in touch with any comments or questions. We hope that you'll tune in to future episodes of our podcast. Please subscribe and rate the show, and be sure to check out the whole range of shows in the Dialogue Podcast Network. Thanks.
Welcome to Bristlecone Firesides, casual conversation around a virtual fireside where we discuss faith, the earth, the universe, and everything. We are your hosts, Abby and Madison.
The central question we ask each other, as well as poets, artists, activists, and other guests around our virtual fireside, is, what does it mean to belong to the earth? So if you've ever wondered how to reground your faith and spiritual practice in the stuff of the earth, this is the podcast for you.
Catch up on previous seasons by subscribing to Bristlecone Firesides on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts.
From the Aspen Mountains, Juniper Forests, Red Rock Deserts, and Salty Lakes of Utah, we wish you peace and goodness as you strive to find yourself in the family of the earth.
Dialogue Podcast Network.